Welcome to the Internet Report. I'm Angelique Medina, and as usual, I'm joined by Archana and we also have a special guest today, David Belson. David Belson is the Senior Director of Internet Research and Analysis at the Internet Society, where he focuses on efforts around Internet measurement, Internet shutdowns, and understanding market trends and how they impact the growth of the Internet around the globe. He has 25 plus years of experience in the Internet infrastructure space. He spent a lot of time at Akamai, where he launched the State of the Internet Report series. And he also publishes a blog called the Internet Disruption Report, where he provides aggregated coverage of internet disruptions taking place in countries around the world, including the causes of these disruptions. So we're really excited to have him join us today. So as usual, we're going to start by talking about some of the overall trends that we're seeing in terms of network availability across ISPs and cloud providers and UCaaS providers. And then we'll talk about some of the interesting events that have occurred over the last week, including some disruptions to some unemployment sites that we've seen occurring over the last few weeks. And then we'll touch on some of the interesting outage events that David has seen in his own work and that he's compiling. So with that, we're going to start by looking at some of these trends. And here, we'll just recap a little bit of what we saw the last few weeks. So overall, good news. We saw towards the end of March, so around March 16th, it started this slight increase. And then over the last week of March into April, held pretty steady. But then last week, we saw a pretty significant decline in the number of outages. So this is actually interesting because it's kind of in line with what we talked about last week, Archana, where we were speculating that the increase that we were seeing in outages didn't appear to be related to congestion because they were longer than what we would typically see under congestion events. And they were simultaneously, in many instances, happening over more locations. So they were more widespread. And that seemed to indicate that they were related to maybe state changes that were being made. So either peering changes or configuration changes that were then leading to these incidents. So this is good news then, right?
Yeah, totally. And also, you know, if it looks like it was indeed those optimizations that were being done internally within the provider networks, and what the peak of traffic that, you know, that's been going up has probably stabilized too. At this point, everybody who's working from home is working from home, right? So the watermark has completely changed, like we were talking about earlier, Angelique, and that's one of the reasons. So you've seen the highest level of traffic, you've made all the changes that you need to from, you know, provider perspective to accommodate for that. So that probably explains the drop off that we are seeing here.
I think, David, you had said that you were tracking some outage or traffic statistics from the ISPs, and you had seen also this sort of increase in traffic levels and then sort of a leveling, if you will.
Right. Yeah. So looking at ISP graphs actually across a number of continents, and some of the graphs that the big CDN providers have published recently. And yeah, it's very much that sort of model where there's the peak that comes right around the time that people are asked to stay at home, the isolation events, and then generally tails off a little bit after that and has hit this new sort of steady state that the provider is obviously able to handle, but it's a little bit higher than it was in general, you know, in February, let's say, you know, about a month before.
So this seems to support kind of the notion that there was a few growing pains in getting to that point of supporting these increased traffic levels. But now it looks like there's, you know, we're getting to a point where, you know, that's the new normal, as you put it. And, you know, it seems like the providers are generally keeping up with the level of traffic. So that's good to see.
Right, and I think the application providers have been doing a lot of work scaling out In many cases, accelerating their year-long scaling plans into a week or two.
Right.
I know that a lot of the ISPs have gone to their participants with offers that basically say like, hey, whatever you need, it's, low cost, it's no cost. Basically, peer with whoever you can at whatever rates you can. So there's been a lot of work done there to help, I think, either minimize or eliminate those bottlenecks.
Yeah, that's a good point, because this was something we touched on very briefly last week, which is the level of collaboration that's been occurring across providers has been really great to see. I mean, there really has been a pulling together of everybody's kind of like, we're gonna do this, we're gonna get through it. So that's been really interesting.
Absolutely.
What I've also heard is between just application providers and ISPs, there's a lot of cost sharing models that are in play as well as they're enhancing their bandwidth. So definitely everybody is coming together to make sure there's enough capacity in there.
Yeah, so we see the same drop in outages in the US as well. That's in line with what we see globally. So that's good. And then in terms of the ISPs, again, same downward trend that we see. It dropped pretty substantially from March levels. So really, very similar to what we saw in late February. So this is starting to look like what we see normally, and again, there are outages that happen across the internet on a normal basis, right? You're never going to get to this, zero level. That's not what normal looks like. Normal is, there are things that happen, whether it's routing related or infrastructure related or security related, like you might see with a DDoS attack. This stuff is pretty normal. So this is looking good overall. And then in the US, of course, again, pretty substantial decline in the number of outages. Cloud providers, we haven't really seen a lot of impact on them over even the March period, where we were seeing kind of a steady rise in overall outages across various providers. Cloud providers have seemed fairly immune to some of the recent issues. And one of the reasons we talked about is, the fact that they run massive global networks. In many cases, they have fairly extensive edges. In particular, Microsoft and Google, they tend to have users enter their network very quickly. And so they have a lot of capacity to absorb traffic surges. That's what they built their network for. So they've fared very well during this period, and this continues to see. We continue to see that these are pretty normal levels overall, very low. And then the collaboration app providers, in terms of their network, so not the application itself, but in terms of their network and issues that we're seeing there, we historically really have barely seen or hardly ever see outage events in the UCaaS provider networks. But that wasn't the case in March. There was this sort of, there was periods throughout March where there was a spike in outages, which is really unusual. And we had kind of speculated a few weeks back that, this was probably something where they were adjusting to just the there's no way that you can plan for the surge that they've experienced. I mean, it's kind of incredible. I mean, millions and millions of call minutes.
200 million users all at once.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty incredible. I think Zoom went from 20, I don't know the exact number, but it was like 22.
Yeah, tens of million to hundreds of millions.
To hundreds of millions, so just an incredible traffic growth, like in a space of a couple of weeks. And, so not unsurprising that, you'd see some issues crop up. But again, that seems to have gone down. So hopefully we're reaching that stability point.
They've responded pretty well, right? From 29 to 9. I mean, that's a big downward sweep. So hopefully that stays or goes down.
Yep. So, again, steady decline. Most of them, or all of them, it looks like, were in the US last week. But, it's going in a good direction.
I wonder if that's a function of most of those providers being based in the U.S.
That probably is what it is.
Infrastructure, but
Yeah, they have more. I would think they would have more points of presence in the U.S. And so you're potentially going to be, depending on where you're located, routed to a POP that's in the United States.
Right.
Also, I'm just wondering if this might be related to last week being like a shorter week because of the Easter holidays.
Oh, yeah, interesting.
Yeah, so when we see week over week next Monday, we'll be able to validate if that hypothesis is accurate or not. But definitely a lot of folks have been off Thursday, Friday.
Interesting.
And I know in many places today's a holiday as well.
Yeah,
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. I didn't realize it was in the US. I did know that I know that in Europe and Australia, it's they had those days off. So yeah, that'll be interesting to see next week or this week. Next week. So that's, effectively just a highlight of what happened last week and some trends that we saw. Another really interesting thing that we looked at and also kind of went back a few weeks looking at was some issues that were cropping up with users trying to connect to the New York Labor Department's unemployment site. Mm-hmm. And that was particularly interesting because it turned out that this did appear to be related to congestion within their network.
Yeah. So what we're seeing here, and this is again traffic patterns and the impact of traffic that we've been seeing all the way up from March to it's ongoing to last week. So what you see here specifically for the New York labor site is that the availability had these trends, and these trends really mapped to time of day. So starting Monday to Friday, you see some interruption with respect to just accessing the website itself, where this is actually the website where you file for unemployment. And over the weekend, there's stability, and then again, March 29th, you start seeing these time of day dips again. So definitely there's a trend that we're seeing. Last week, however, this came down a little bit compared to the previous 2 weeks, just from an availability perspective. But still, there's definitely some kind of disruption going on, mapping again to time of day. So during the week, people are filing, more people are accessing the website to file these claims, and then that's kind of resulting in this. But I think what was very interesting for us to look at is this really mapped to an overall end-to-end packet loss, and which coincided with that time of day pattern that we were seeing from Monday to Friday with respect to accessing the site. But if we came down to notice where this congestion was or where this packet loss was, it was not necessarily on the internet per se. It was actually within the hosting location of where New York's unemployment website hosted itself. So it's within their own data centers that they are hosting this application. We started seeing this increasing packet loss, and that went through. This was the week of last week to like about April 1st, and then again over here when we come down to April 6th, we start seeing very similar patterns as well. But this was all indications that the congestion was within the data center or within where the application was hosted itself. And if we looked at some of the news articles that was going around because of this disruption last week, there was mention about increasing capacity within the network. And this probably is capacity from an application perspective on the server, as well as capacity within the internal network as well to the routers or the switches that are, involved in there.
Yeah. What's interesting, there's a couple of things. I mean, from a pattern standpoint, it really does map to the advice that's been given to have certain folks with last names have been given a designated day of the week to apply. And those days are Monday through Wednesday. And then Thursday, Friday, and Saturday are sort of wild card days, but we're really seeing like Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then a little bit on Friday is where you see those heavy peaks, and not so much on a Saturday, which, is maybe, it's not, maybe people are trying to follow the advice of just filing on those specific days, but there's less traffic, it appears, or congestion on Saturday
on the weekend.
and over the weekend. Yeah. They didn't specify Sunday. I'm not sure why, but I assume you can also apply on a Sunday. The other thing that's interesting is that they're really just hosted out of a single data center, and they're not using any public cloud services or a CDN to front end their site, which could make it harder to very quickly absorb the level of traffic that they would have seen over the last few weeks.
I think for me, the moving to a public cloud, that's not surprising because these are government federal agencies. So they're like kind of maybe a little slower in terms of the actual quote unquote cloud migration. But the front ending without a CDN, that's definitely surprising. And we noticed this pattern across a couple of other unemployment sites as well.
California and some, yeah.
So
I guess,
surprising.
So my guess there also is that, I guess is twofold. One is, that they are effectively in the, October, early November period of Black Friday shopping, where you don't want to touch the site no matter what at this point. A, and then B, you're dealing with state purchasing processes. So yeah, they're at this point, they're all probably would love to clamor onto, Amazon Cloud or Google Cloud or Oracle Cloud, whatever. But, again, A, they're on lockdown for the infrastructure, but B, they probably have to go through a multi-month, procurement process that would get them there.
Yep. It'd be interesting to see after we come out of COVID, how some of these sites do end up changing. So over time, if we can keep track of their connectivity architecture, maybe they will move to the cloud. Maybe they will have CDNs.
It'd be interesting also to understand the backends on these as well. So, I mean, in this case, it looked like the traffic may not have even been getting to the back end because of the congestion on the front end. But, New Jersey had put out that call for COBOL programmers. And, I'm guessing they're not the only one. They're just the first one to raise their hand. And I'm kicking myself for taking Pascal in 10th grade instead of COBOL. Could have had a side gig here.
Yeah, that's really interesting because it seems like, and we've seen this issue with other sites that have seen a pretty significant surge as well, which is that whether it's a legacy network or hosting or application architecture, that's where we're seeing a lot more pain. In some instances, we've seen providers who are getting an increase in traffic, and maybe they're handling the traffic okay, but their application response time is really slow, and these are often companies that have been in business a lot longer and probably have more technical debt. And so really, this is kind of just points to the real impact of your architectural choices, whether they be network or application related. And cloud providers, like other services like CDN providers, kind of the real winners here. And so it'd be interesting to see if this perhaps triggers, as you mentioned, Archana, kind of some, not to use a very, a marketing term, but digital transformation. I said it. But that they start to rethink, their posture, if you will, and realizing just how little agility they have to respond to changes in need. So, if there's any good outcome from this, that would certainly be one of them.
Right. And it's definitely not that the internet is congested, right?
No.
And this just reiterates the fact that the internet's actually able to handle it. We didn't see any issues getting within that data center where the application's hosted, but it was congestion, smaller parts of where the application's hosted on network. So
These have all been very much site or application specific, whether the issue's been related to the network or to the application itself. And that's somewhat good news, because that means that where we are seeing issues, they're relatively contained versus like something widespread or systemic. So that's good. And I know that you've been tracking some interesting things that happened last week, David.
Yeah, I mean, and it's just to the point you just made. That was when I published a blog post about internet resilience for the Internet Society at the end of February, kind of before all this really hit. And there was some discussion of will the internet be able to handle all this? And one of the points I'd made in the post was that yes, we expect the internet to be able to handle all this, which I think you guys are showing, but that where we expected to see the problems was most likely going to be on the application side. And I think that's bearing out like what you just said. What I'm doing, so a few things. One is, as we talked about earlier, I've been looking at a lot of the articles and blog posts from the various providers, and looking at data from like ISPs and the network providers, trying to understand what changes have they seen as a result of all the shift from working from home. Have they been able to handle it? And by and large, the answer has been yes. Again, as you've pointed out, there have been some hiccups more on the platform sides, and a little bit, I think, also as we expected on some of the first mile connections. I think we're all privileged enough to have high-speed internet access, which is great, and it's probably less likely to become congested. But when you have a more restricted, home internet connection, or you're reliant on mobile tethering, it's going to be hard to do the streaming plus the video conferencing plus whatever else you need to do. So compiling a lot of that data together to do a set of follow-up blog posts about internet resilience. And then I've also been looking at, as part of the Internet Disruption Report, I look at things at a more aggregate level, generally more of a country level. So been working on putting together the March report. And I think a couple of the major things that stood out there. One was 7 separate power outages in Venezuela that impacted connectivity there. They as I've found writing the report over the last year and doing similar work prior to that, there are a handful of common root causes. And Venezuela's power infrastructure seems to be particularly problematic. And in past months, there's been 1 or 2 power outages that have been significant enough to impact connectivity. In March, though, there were 7. So we'll be looking at that and what parts of the country did it impact. And then submarine cables and problems with those cables have also been a common factor. So 2 that stood out in March were the SAT-3 cable, which problems there impacted connectivity in Angola and Gabon. And then there was apparently what was called a dragon storm in Egypt. I guess this was a pretty significant storm that created problems with the EC cable, EASSY, I'm assuming I'm pronouncing it correctly, which had measured impact on, I think, up to 10 countries. So some generally more significant than the other. And then month to date in April, so over the last 2 weeks, the ACE cable, Africa coast to Europe, had some problems earlier in the month, and that's caused connectivity problems in Mauritania and Liberia. And then the SIMIWI 4 cable, or SMW4, which has historically had a lot of problems as well, had more issues and impacted connectivity to about 5 or 6 other countries. So, we talk, I think we here you've gone into a lot more detail looking at more specific issues. In what I've been tracking, they've been more aggregate, more higher level. And I think harder to, what's the word? Not authenticate.
To sort of know what the actual user,
yes, well, not so much the user impact, but the attribution. That's the word I'm looking for. Right. So we can see through measurement that there are issues in a particular set of countries, and you have to start looking for the commonalities. and say, oh, these are all connected to this given cable. Sometimes an affected provider will say something, and they'll post something that says, oh, our upstream provider is having problems, or there's been a cut on the SMW4 cable or the 8th cable that's created problems for our subscribers. We sincerely apologize, and so on. But in many cases, the consortiums that own the cables don't say anything.
Yeah.
In many cases, the providers don't say anything. So it becomes really challenging to definitively attribute the problems that we see.
Yeah,
there's
there's
the Venezuela outages that you were talking about in March. The substantially high number. Do you see that related to the situation we are in, or are they just independent occurrences?
They're independent occurrences. I think that Venezuela has had historically problematic power infrastructure, and I think just in March happened to have enough power outages that had had a sufficient impact on internet connectivity. If you look through the Twitter feed for I can't remember the name of the power company there, but they have a pretty active Twitter feed. And pretty much like every day, they're something, we have dispatching crews here, dispatching crews there to fix this issue, to fix that issue. So I think, they're in a constant state of repair. I think not all of the power problems there, though, have a widespread impact on internet connectivity.
Got it.
And one of the interesting things too is that we see oftentimes power outages are hard to detect through internet monitoring because, in many cases, the endpoints that are being measured are within data centers. And generally the data centers will have backup power, they'll have better power. So it's when you start seeing, traffic loss from subscriber connections, and when you start seeing measurements to endpoints within the subscriber ISPs failing, that's generally when it starts to show up in these types of reports.
Got it. Okay.
Interesting. Yeah, I think it's, you've been doing this for a while in terms of compiling a lot of these incidents and kind of collecting them and documenting them, which I think over time is really helpful because it helps people to understand what baseline is, that there are, a variety of different issues that can happen. And, to your point, in the case of Venezuela, this is, fairly common and not necessarily attributable to any political climate or anything like that. And the internet is so vast that having different angles on what's going on, whether it be sort of at the kind of the infrastructure level or even just kind of like the cable level, the pipes, and understanding that, or even the advantage that, for example, maybe the CDN providers or the cloud providers have, because every one of them has a slightly different view or picture of what's going on, and the same with all the ISPs. And no one of these entities can see the whole picture. It's really just through some compositing of if that's a word, of all of these data sets. Does it start to emerge of like what the overall kind of state of the internet is, if you will?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's absolutely true. And so one of the other projects I'm working on at the Internet Society is around, they've put forth 8 project areas that they're focusing on for 2020. So I'm involved with the Measuring the Internet project, surprise, surprise, and focusing specifically on a use case around internet shutdowns. So that is one of the things we're trying to do, is work with partners to aggregate these different vantage points to really help understand, okay, this set of measurements saw a problem in a given country at a given time, but this set didn't. So, was it really a shutdown or was it something else? And in looking at some of these events and some of these disruption events, they're definitely more evident in certain types of measurements than others.
Yeah, that's interesting. Maybe, I think it'd be helpful to give us an overview of kind of what the mandate is of the Internet Society, because you mentioned like this work around disruption. Is it because they want to track issues around internet sovereignty or like censorship, or is there a broader agenda, and what is sort of the mandate of the Internet Society overall?
Sure. So, I mean, our aim is to, is the internet is for everyone. So making sure that, no, I shouldn't say making sure, but, helping to drive towards making sure that everybody has internet connectivity and usable internet connectivity, and making sure that the internet remains open, globally connected, secure, and trustworthy. And those are, I think, 4 key areas that we focus the project areas on, that we focus the advocacy work and the policy work. We do a lot of work around ISP deployment. We do a lot of work around community network deployment. So those unserved and underserved areas, trying to bring them onto the internet. Doing a lot of work around encryption, time security. The project I'm involved with, measuring the internet. So we've broken it out into 4 use cases. But really, ultimately, trying to ensure that the internet is available and is usable for as many people as possible.
Yeah, that's great. Well, then I guess, maybe the last thing we can cover here is your thoughts on how the recent events could potentially impact rulings around net neutrality going forward, given that the internet has kind of been seen as very essential to everyone recently. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. If there's thinking that, because I think in the last ruling they basically said it's not really a utility, but can the case be made now that it is actually quite essential?
So I think the case can absolutely be made that it's essential. I'm going to actually sidestep the question of net neutrality, because that is a rat hole that I don't want to go down.
Fair.
But having said that, I think that the current events hopefully will do more to get the policymakers around the world to help close the digital divide. So, again, there are a lot of places, even in the US, where high-speed broadband is either not affordable or not available.
Yep.
You have kids sitting in cars outside of school buildings or libraries trying to, snag the Wi-Fi signal to get their homework done. Internationally, there are, in many countries, the internet infrastructure, especially the last mile infrastructure, is just insufficient.
Yeah.
And hopefully there can be a lot more investment made in really bringing that up to a usable level, and to creating environments that are sufficiently competitive, where the cost of getting online is much more reasonable.
Well, I think that's a great place to end the show today. So, Archana, why don't you take us out?
Yeah, sure. David, thank you so much for being on the show. Great hearing from you and your perspective of how the internet is doing. And again, Angelique, it'll be very interesting to see next week how the ISPs do and how the UCAS providers do as well.
Absolutely.
Hopefully we'll have another outage and we can talk about it again. So every week there seems to be an interesting outage that you're covering.
Top security.
Yeah, but I think the key is these outages, happen with or without COVID,
Absolutely.
right? That's the key to remember. We've seen these outages before COVID. We are seeing them during, and we will continue to see them after the situation's passed. So with that, if you're interested in hearing more about, how we understand outages, how we dissect that, feel free to just subscribe to our blog.thousandice.com, or follow us on Twitter. Until then, have a safe week, and we'll see you next week, guys.